the Gazans, the Palestinians, attacked Israel over the weekend, and there's a lot of discussion about this and a lot of parallels being drawn, mostly to 9/11. And I brought this up on Twitter, and it was interesting because about half of the people who responded flamed at me, and the other half of the people were like, "Yeah, you're absolutely right." And so I'm expecting. Well, it was Twitter, so it's become a right-wing cesspool. So, in fact, I posted a piece overnight. In fact, I posted it last night, pointing out that Donald Trump gave, in his first weeks in office, gave the Russians intelligence about something going on in Israel. Now, we still don't know for sure exactly what it was, but the Israelis were totally freaked out about it. They had to burn a spy over this, the person who came up with the information. And, so I was speculating, is this Donald Trump giving Russia information about the Iron Dome capabilities, the Israeli anti-missile capabilities, and then Russia hands that off to Iran, which of course they would, they're allies, and Iran then hands it off to Hamas. Of course they would, they fund Hamas. And that allows Hamas to do the attacks on Israel that we're seeing right now. Now, this was purely speculation on my part. We do know that Donald Trump did burn intelligence officers or some intelligence that had to do with Israel and the Middle East. But we don't know much beyond that. But it was, it was in the Washington Post. I mean, it was right up there. The title of the article, it's by Greg Miller and Greg Jaffe, and it's titled, "Trump Revealed Highly Classified Information to Russian Foreign Minister and Ambassador." It was considered so secret that details have been withheld from allies and tightly restricted even within the U.S. government. I'm reading from the Washington Post piece, officials said. The partner had not given it turns out it was Israel. The partner had not given the United States permission to share the material with Russia, and officials said Trump's decision to do so endangers cooperation from an ally that has access to the inner workings of the Islamic State. Again, that's Israel, we now know. One U.S. official familiar with the matter, using terminology that refers to one of the highest classification levels used by American spy agencies, said this was code word information. Trump revealed more information to the Russian ambassador than we have shared with our own allies. Whoa. And then the article goes on to point out, last week, Trump fired FBI Director James Comey. Keep in mind, this is a 6-year-old article. In the midst of a bureau investigation into possible links between the Trump campaign and Moscow, Trump's subsequent admission that his decision was driven by, quote, "this Russia thing," end quote, his decision to fire Comey, was seen by critics as attempted as obstruction of justice. One day after dismissing Comey, Trump welcomed Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Ambassador Sergei Kislyak into the Oval Office. For almost anyone in government, discussing such matters with an adversary would be illegal. In fact, it would be considered treason. Most alarmingly, the Washington Post writes, officials said Trump revealed the city in the Islamic State's territory where the U.S. intelligence partner detected the threat. That allowed them to figure out who the Russians and the Muslims, or the Arab, the Hamas. Let's not paint too broad a brush here. This is not all Muslims. It's not all Arabs. This is Hamas, and the Palestinians in Gaza. That they could have figured this stuff out. So number one, did did Donald Trump play a role in this? Number two, everybody's making this 9/11 analogy, and I think that there's something to be said about that. 9/11 was supposedly an intelligence failure. You recall Condoleezza Rice saying, we never could have imagined that somebody would hijack airplanes and use them as missiles to attack Americans. She literally said that, Condoleezza Rice, when she was Secretary of State. But here's what's weird. She said that just a few months after she had been moved out of a hotel in Italy and onto an aircraft carrier offshore in the Mediterranean because there was a credible threat that al-Qaeda was going to hijack airplanes and crash them into the buildings in Italy where this meeting was being held. Now, this was before 9/11. And then after 9/11, Condoleezza Rice comes out and says, we never could have imagined airplanes. So anyhow, the 9/11 analogy is being made because it's a so-called intelligence failure. I think, frankly, it was more than just an intelligence failure on the part of the George W. Bush administration. But that's, conspiracy theory for another time. I think a better analogy, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, is that rather than saying that this is 9/11, because Osama bin Laden was not being oppressed by America. He was pissed off because we were buying oil cheap from Saudi Arabia. But that's not like, putting 2 million people in an open-air prison camp. I think a better analogy is Northern Ireland. In Northern Ireland, you had a country or a region that was occupied by the British for a long, long time. And eventually, the people who lived there, it started in a big way in the 1920s, rose up and said, no, we don't want this. We want self-rule. We want independence. And Britain tried to crush that movement, the Irish Republican Army. And they engaged in horrific violence. Louise and I were in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. We got followed around by a half-track, by a pickup truck with a submachine gun on the back, who was pointing it at our back window of our car as they escorted us out of town. It was a very bizarre experience, I can tell you. This was back in the late 70s, early 80s. We also had 3 kids in the car when it happened. But the people of Northern Ireland said no, and they, like I said, they did terrible things. They cut the tongues out of people. They raped women as a way of saying, this is what we can do. They murdered people. They bombed people. They decapitated people. Well, actually, I'm not sure if any decapitations happened with the IRA, but they killed a lot of people. In fact, they killed over 3,000 people. So, I mentioned that on Twitter, and again, that was the one where I got the flames, from people saying, how dare you, and nobody died from the Troubles. Of course, people just, are historically ignorant. This is probably people who are, weren't born in 1970 or 1980 or before. But here you have a people saying we want independence and we're willing to kill people to get it. Which is not to say that what Hamas did is noble in any way or to justify it. I think it's terrible. It's wrong. What they did is an act of terror. And the fact that they targeted civilians makes it even more an act of terror. Although the IRA did also targeted civilians. But finally, my final thought on this is that that's a terribly imperfect analogy. I think it's a better analogy than 9/11, but I'm not sure we need analogies here. What we have is a terrorist attack on Israel by Hamas. And, hopefully, once the brutality is over and the real brutality, the large numbers of deaths are going to be coming in the next few days as Israel, strikes into Gaza. And we'll see. I mean, hopefully they do this in a civilized fashion. But, war is hardly ever civilized. But, the bottom line is that, we need to stand with Israel in this, and we need to be demanding a 2- or 3-state solution. A 3-state solution would be Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank. And, in other words, creating 3 nations, which is what I think makes the most sense, because the West Bank is so cut off from Gaza that, it couldn't really be one country. But anyway, those are my thoughts on it. I'm curious to hear yours.